In our previous video, we talked about how Christopher Columbus visited America in 1492 until the Jamestown settlement. Today, we are going to talk about the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower ship until 1773 Boston Tea Party. Let's first take a look at the timeline of key events during the 1600s. In 1620, a sailing ship called the Mayflower set sail from England with 102 pilgrims on board. Most of them set sail in order to be free to worship what they believed in. While some passengers were seeking religious freedom, others were simply hoping to start a new life in the New World or America. It contained the pilgrims' necessities on board their ship: tools for making a living, root vegetables and lemon crates, sugar and flour sacks, beef, pork, and even seeds for planting in the spring. They also brought small furniture, blankets, linens, and clothing with them. Their journey, however, was not easy. The pilgrims witnessed the weather deteriorating and the Mayflower ship being rocked by strong gales. As a result, many of them became seasick and their lives became miserable. They saw land after 65 days, but instead of landing in Virginia, they discovered they were in Cape Cod. But before the pilgrims come ashore, the 41 male assemble ashore for a Mayflower compact. Everyone, pilgrims or not, would be subject to the same laws under this agreement. In December, they discovered the ideal location for them to stay, which they later named Plymouth. They unloaded their cargo and urged everyone to work quickly in preparation for the upcoming winter. Their first winter was bleak. They were starving, and many of them became ill and died as a result. After some time, a Native American unexpectedly walked into their settlement and greeted them in English. Samoset, along with Squanto and the Wampanoags, assisted the pilgrims in farming, fruit identification, and fishing. And after the first harvest in 1621, the pilgrims invited them to their Thanksgiving. From there, the Plymouth colony grew bigger. Next on our timeline is during 1629. Another event that happened during the 17th century was that Puritans also left England to seek their religious rights, and they were also in search of economic growth. The Puritans were a religious dissident group who believed the Church of England was too closely associated with Catholicism and needed to be restructured. And with John Winthrop's leadership, he established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When the Puritans arrived in America, they encountered the same harsh weather and food shortages as the Pilgrims. As a result, there was a split in the population. Some Puritan groups resisted the colony's strict rules. Before they arrived in Massachusetts, not all of them agreed on what they had discussed. Several people left the state and relocated to Connecticut. The third event on our timeline is about the Salem witch trial during 1692. The Salem witch trial occurred concurrently with the establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Over 200 people were charged with witchcraft. Between February 1692 and May 1693, they took place in Massachusetts, specifically in the village of Salem. When the Puritans settled in Salem in 1626, life became strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles were common due to the Puritans' rules, and the villagers' relationships were restrained. Furthermore, the winter of 1692 was the worst and coldest on record. Betty Paris and Abigail Williams began to have temper tantrums the same year. Dr. William Griggs saw no illness, but diagnosed them with bewitchment. Other young women soon began to exhibit similar behaviors to the cousins, and a wave of hysteria swept through Massachusetts. Bridget Bishop was the first witch to be convicted. She was charged because she wore black clothing and strange costumes, which were against the Puritans' rules. On June 10, 1692, she was hanged at Gallows Hill. After that, 18 more people were accused of practicing witchery and were executed by hanging after being convicted of being a witch. Many accused witch also died in prison, tortured brutally and burnt alive. They accused more people, but the hysteria died in September 1692. People started to turn against the trial, with the last one ending in 1693. The next topics that we're going to talk about in our timeline are the war between French and Indians until the British win the French and Indian War, gaining most of France's territory in North America. The French and Indian War, or also known as the 7 Years' War, was the conflict between Great Britain and France against each other for control of the North American continent. When France's expansion into the Ohio River Valley came into conflict with British colonial claims, A series of battles resulted in the official British War of Aggression in 1756. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, a commander of British forces, set out with his men in 1754 for the Ohio River Valley to assist in the construction of a fort. A small French company led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville left French Fort Duquesne to keep an eye on British movements. When Washington became aware of the French movement, he set out with his party to meet them, and attack them near Pennsylvania's Great Meadows. Jumonville and 9 of his men were killed, and 21 others were injured in the battle. A survivor returned to Fort Duquesne and reported what had happened to his superiors. Washington returned to Great Meadows and built Fort Necessity. Unfortunately, the French captured Fort Necessity in July 1754, and Washington was held responsible. He resigned and later returned to the army as a volunteer under British command. On February 10, 1763, the British won the French and Indian War after several years of fighting, capturing the majority of France's territory in North America. France surrendered all of its mainland North American territories under the terms of the treaty, effectively ending any foreign military threat to the British colonies. After the 7 Years' War, Stamp Act happened. The British Parliament passed the Stamp Act on March 22, 1765, to help pay for British forces stationed in the colonial possessions during the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. The act mandated that the colonies pay a tax, which was represented by a stamp on various documents and papers. It occurred at a time when the British Empire was deeply in debt on top of the 7 Years' War and was looking to its North American colonies for revenue. The Boston Massacre occurred on a cold winter evening in February 1770. The street brawl rose as a patriot mob hurled snowballs and stones at a squad of British soldiers. As the mob hurled insults and threats at them, the soldiers opened fire, killing several colonists. The Boston Massacre sparked the American Revolution because it was an unplanned outburst of violence by British troops. Last on our timeline is the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party occurred in 1773. It was an American colonists' protest against the British government. They did this to save one prominent company, the East India Company, from bankruptcy, but the colonists were outraged when they discovered that Britain was attempting to give the British a monopoly on American soil while bypassing the American tea merchant. They organized the protest by boarding 3 trade ships in Boston Harbor and throwing the tea cargo overboard into the sea. 342 tea chests were dumped into the water. Some colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, but no one was tricked. The British had figured out who had ruined the tea. In retaliation, the Coercive Acts, later known as the Intolerable Acts, were passed. On our next video, we are going to talk about the First Continental Congress until the end of the Revolutionary War. I hope you enjoyed our video lesson for today. Thank you for watching.